Hey guys, Stealth here and welcome back to Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. In this tutorial we're going to be looking at fleet command. How do you command your ships and how do you use formations? Now, first things first, very important always to index at the start of the battle, what do you have? You always, at least in the current version of the game, get to only design one ship class. So that means that in this case, I could have designed battleships. Now I just hit a quick design, so I didn't even design anything. But let's say that I handcrafted the battleships. That means I know exactly what they're capable of and what their armaments are. In order to properly assign ships to a formation or to properly command your fleet, always figure out what they can do, where their main armament is, and what sort of specs they have. Insofar as you can. It's not always easy because it requires quite a bit of insight into the game. Now, I usually go from big to small. So we have a group of light cruisers here. Don't look at those yet. I'm not interested. Because I know I have battleships. I have battle cruisers, Ohio and Famous. And the Alaska back there. I have heavy cruisers. I have light cruisers. And I have destroyers. So I have a fairly large formation here. What I'm interested in is what can the other ships do? So in this case, let's have a look at the battleships first. These battleships, not particularly quick. That immediately jumps out at me. This means that if I want to keep the whole formation in a group, the whole formation is going to be pretty slow. 20.5 knots. Something else that I want to look at. How survivable is this ship? It has few bulkheads. That means that you want it to get torpedoed even less than you might normally do. Getting torpedoed in a ship with few bulkheads is asking for trouble. Also interested to know is where is my main armament? Because some ships have them on the front, like this thing. At least it has the majority of its firepower on the bow. Some of it have most of their firepower on the stern. And especially the AI is prone to coming up with some curious designs. So the battleship, not fast. And then I look at few bulkheads. I can see that it has 15-inch armament, which can range out to 22.6, as you can see on the top right-hand side of the screen as I hover over the 15-inch gun. You can also see that it has a good amount of secondary armament, so that means that if a destroyer closes in, it can actually defend itself rather well. What else do I look at? Auxiliary systems. This is pretty much a flat modifier that boosts almost every part of the ship. I'm looking at what kind of anti-torpedo protection it has, what kind of citadel it has, and also whether it has sonar. Sonar to acoustics is what you can see at the bottom of that list. And this tells me that this ship, yes, is capable of detecting enemy torpedoes at a bonus of a range, instead of and not having either sonar or hydrophone. And that means that your ship is going to be even more prone to getting attacked with torpedoes, or at least getting hit, because you can't see them. So always index first. What I'm usually particularly interested in is what my big ships can do, because they're the ones that are going to usually, anyway, those are the ones that are usually going to be dealing most of the damage. So in this case, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana. They're the three battleships that I have. Then I have Ohio, Famous, and Alaska. Again, what do I have? These ships have 17-inch guns, which have a range of 24 kilometers. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that you want to keep them at 24 kilometers, because you're also looking into what sort of range-finding system they have. This ship happens to be in possession of quite a good rangefinder, RNG S4, range F. That's shorthand for rangefinder, that's the white text, and then RNG S is rangefinder stereoscopic 4. Stereoscopic rangefinder happens to be quite good at range, so you don't need to get these things in close, which for a battlecruiser is usually not what you want to do anyway. I'm also looking at speed. I'm seeing that these things are far faster than my battleships, which indicates to me that I can use them either in a more mobile role. I don't have to, but I can. And as for protection, minimum bulkheads. Really don't get these things torpedoed. They will fill up very, very quickly. Secondary armament, fairly limited. If I were to use this ship, I would keep it at great distance So let's say about 20 kilometers away from the battleships and only target the battleships. If a smaller ship comes close, a destroyer, head away from the fleet, or head away from the enemy. Next up, ship class, heavy cruiser. Usually a bit of a jack of all trade, depending on how the AI generates your ship, or unless you have it designed yourself, of course. 7-inch guns on this one, meaning that it doesn't have a terribly good range, but it has a 15-second reload. And with 7-inch guns, that makes it suitable to deal with light cruisers and destroyers particularly. Maybe heavy cruisers. Now I'm also seeing 5-inch guns, I'm seeing a lot of 3-inch, 2-inch and more 2-inch, but I'm also seeing torpedoes. Heavy cruisers, and of course, well, pretty much every ship class can carry torpedoes, but not always do. I'm interested to see what the range is. It's only 12.2. Now that might be tempting to use against enemy ships, but it will depend on whether it's useful or not, indicated by how dangerous it is to close on the enemy formation. Not too much more on that in this video, because I can talk about that for quite a while. Light cruisers. We have Marblehead, Providence, Tucson, and Langley. What I'm interested in with light cruisers is what their sonar capability is. So I'm immediately looking at their components, and I'm seeing Hydro 3 acoustics. Hydro is always less good than sonar. Sonar is just the next tech that you can get. And this means that these ships are adequate as a screening force. They could be used in, let's say, an outer ring around your battleships, so that they spot any torpedoes. You're going to have to keep a really close eye on the list down here to see if they spot any torpedoes. Because, at least in the current version of the game, you don't get a lot of indicators. World of Warships, for example, tells you by giving an increasingly annoying ping, or an audible warning at least. This game does not. The only warning that you're going to get is the torpedo slamming into the side of your hull. And finally, destroyers. What do my destroyers do in this battle? Well, they have minimum bulkheads, which makes them very prone to sinking. Torpedoes ranging out to 8.5. This is very bad news for this destroyer design, because this means that the destroyers have to get into secondary range, at least secondary range of the battleships. And I'm saying at least secondary range of the battleships because their battleships are usually escorted by another ring of ships. Heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, and battle cruisers. So if I wanted to commence with a torpedo attack, it's going to be hard. At least until later in the battle, when they might have an opportunity to let's say, hunt down, chase down wounded ships. Now, that indexing phase is out of the way. What do I have? Second question, how is it positioned? My battleships are over here. Okay. Then I have a large line of light cruisers behind it, over there. Alright. I have one heavy cruiser ahead, which the AI, or the game, for all of its wisdom, put in a single formation that does not have any kind of a task. And tasks I'll look into in a second. We have the battle cruisers, which are also in their separate formation. They're Division 2. Heavy cruisers are in another division. They're also not tasked with any particular order. The destroyers are. The destroyers are tasked, and you can see that by the line that runs all the way from Div 7 to Div 1. They're tasked with a scouting command. And this means that they will try and spot the target for the bigger ships. Now in this case they don't have to, because I already know where they are. But the scouting command means that the division will follow the, let's say, the principal, the division that they're supposed to follow, in a really large, loose formation, and they will just try and scout out against the enemy. I would not recommend using that particular command, because it is just not very useful. Now, in this case, I know where my fleet is, I know how they're positioned. What's the enemy fleet doing? Currently, they seem to be leading with a battle cruiser, I think. Or sorry, no, they're trailing with the battle cruiser because they're heading away. Now I know that this is a battlecruiser because as I'm looking over here on the left hand side of the screen, I can see that it has 3x2 14-inch guns, and 14-inch guns is not something you can put on a heavy cruiser. So it has to be at least a battlecruiser and potentially more. I'm thinking it might be more because over here on the top left side of the screen you can see 3. These are their battleships, because the game always sorts formations from biggest ships to smallest ships. So I know where their battleships are. The next question I want to know is how far are they away? Tennessee is 22.3 clicks away from the unidentified Japanese battleship here. That means that these guns are officially in range, but will rather soon go out of range. So in this case, this battleship is not really an ideal target, because as you can see, it's right on the edge of my operational range for the 15-inch guns. So I would probably not pick the battleships as a target, but I would pick the trailing battlecruiser, which is only 16 clicks away. And as you can see, the game has already selected that as the target. It just doesn't know it yet, because the ship hasn't been properly identified. Now that I know where my ships are and where their ships are, I can start to build a plan. How do I want to engage these guys? Well, in this case, I probably want to stay at range for a while, just to try and see if I can exchange some fire with them. So, since they're heading away in that direction, if I were to turn to starboard, turn to the right, turn away from them, I would be losing range even faster. So I'm going to turn to port, left, and try and more or less keep at range with them. The AI always maneuvers, and the AI sometimes turns away, turns towards you. It really depends on what their plan is. Now, the next step is to make my life a little easier, because I have so many different divisions, and I would rather not focus on managing all the divisions all the time. In this case, I could tell the battlecruisers to start following around with the battleships. If you want to do that, you click over here on Steady, you click Follow, and then you right-click the division that you want the ships to follow. So in this case, you click Div 1. And by doing that, Div 3... you do that by following the last ship of the fleet, or of the div, so the Louisiana. And you can see that now there is a line drawn from Ohio to Louisiana, and that means that the Ohio will now line up behind Louisiana. Now there is something to be said for this, which is it's easier, you don't have to manage as much, but as we have figured in the indexing phase, you have a very fast battlecruiser, which doesn't do very well when close to enemy ships. And destroyers are quite likely to try and engage Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana, so I really don't want to make it easy for them. So for this particular battle, I would not recommend that you use the follow command on the battleships, on the battle cruisers. In this case, I would just tell them to also start turning to port. Now, what do we do with the other ships? First, try to make your life a little easier and decide what you want to do with them. In this case, I have my battleships over here. They have some sonar of their own, but their turning circle is 592 meters, which for a battleship is, that's alright. I've seen turning circles go as low as 250 and as high as about 2000. So 592 is really not that bad. But in case these ships do come under torpedo attack, I would like a bit more warning. And that is where the division from the Marblehead's going to come in. That is Division 6. And as you can see over here, the line follows Division 1. And the command is follow. Except I don't want them to follow. I want them to screen. This creates a formation where they are sort of forming up in a, as it says, they split up and formed circular around the target division. So what's going to happen is that once the formation actually aligns, and that can take some time in this game, the Marblehead division will form up in a protective shield around the battleships. Keep in mind what the speed of the various ships are as you're using them. Because in this case, I have fairly slow battleships of only 20 knots. If I were to have light cruisers, which could only do 20 knots, they probably wouldn't be able to fall into formation or take up their defensive positions around the main fleet or around the main div, because they wouldn't be fast enough. So always try to keep in mind that your escorting ships have to be faster if they want to be using that screening command. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. Now, once it's set to screen, you don't really have to do that much. Just let them be. Let them be, let them follow or screen, and that's just about it. They will engage nearby threats, but they will do so from the formation. So they will do so while they're following the principal, which in this case is the Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana. Then we have the heavy cruisers. Now, this lonely heavy cruiser here, Canberra, I would love to join this one up with the other div here, the Olympia, Columbia, and Los Angeles. In order to do that, I first need to figure out which ships those are. They're Div 4, and Div 3 is the Canberra. Easiest to do this is just hold left click on Div 3 and drag it over to Div 4, and that immediately puts all of these ships in the now formed Div 3. This will force the Canberra to try and fall in behind Los Angeles. Now, that's as good a time as any to talk about the formation buttons. You have 3 different formations in the current iteration of the game, which is Alpha 10. We have a tight formation, we have a normal formation, and we have a loose formation. Tight formation, as the game writes on its own website, is easier to control. It has a lower speed. It restricts the speed of all ships to make sure that nobody falls behind, and that all ships can actually stay in that tight formation. The problem with a tight formation is that you become a bigger torpedo hazard. Let's say that these ships were in a tight formation. If that happens, and somebody torpedoes Olympia, that immediately potentially puts Columbia and Los Angeles at risk as well. Because they wouldn't maintain this distance. No, Olympia would have Columbia trailing her at a distance like that. So I generally recommend against the tight formation, because it makes your life quite difficult. There is a mistake here, slash something that they haven't worked out of the tooltip yet. The ships keep a smaller distance between them and can gain an accuracy bonus by sustaining a cruising speed. Yes, previously you used to be able to get an accuracy bonus from a tight formation, but that no longer works. So a tight formation, a normal formation, or a loose formation is not like you can use that as an accuracy booster. You can, however, with your ships, set the speed to cruise, which is full speed. And by doing that, you gain an accuracy bonus, but that has nothing to do with this formation. The normal formation is the one that I recommend. Loose formation is if you have a ship... Well, if you have several different ships in a formation that you don't really care about how they stick to that formation, they don't really have to be in a line. In that case, you can go with loose. This also allows all ships to reach their maximum speed. Because if I want to use the maximum speed on Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and Louisiana on these battleships, the game just goes, nope, can't do it. I can drag it to flank, but it's going to fight me. It's going to stick to full. If I switch to normal, it's still going to fight me. It's going to push it back to 16. Whereas if I spread it to loose, now I can actually... That is, if the game is willing. Nope. It's still fighting me. Normally, you would be able to go full speed with these things. However, the formation is set to loose, so it's not like they really have to maintain their position in the formation. Now, we have the heavy cruisers over here. Not necessarily a great position. So I could also have these guys in a loose formation in this case act as a screening force around the battleships. And by doing this, I don't have to keep too close of an eye on the heavy cruisers. I only have to worry about whether they're getting torpedoed or not. Now I still have one lonely light cruiser, at least I believe I do. Ah, that's Div 4. Div 4 is already executing a screening command around the Pennsylvania. And that means that they are taking a position port and starboard of Pennsylvania and perfectly illustrating what the screening command does. It does require that your ships are in a loose formation, so that they don't really have to stick very close to side by side or in a formation following each other. They can just be very far apart, but they will try and screen, and that means that they'll move with the formation that they're assigned to. So if I make a starboard turn with the Pennsylvania, which means a starboard turn with the whole Tennessee group, then they're going to do the same thing. Very easy to save yourself a lot of micromanagement. Now, what else is there? Formation ahead or formation abreast? In this case, I would like to stick the battleships in formation line ahead, because this way they can move in a column, so they all follow each other. This is, in my case, fortunate, because as I'm turning to port, as I'm turning that way, I can bring all my guns to bear against the target. If I have a couple of ships which are all going to be closing in on the enemy, in that case I might want to use line abreast, although I rarely use it. The way that this works is that the ships are not going to be following each other anymore, they're going to be in a line. So that means that you'd have Tennessee, then Pennsylvania, and then Louisiana. And by doing that, you can charge towards an enemy and still not present a wide profile. Because if I'm presenting this profile, I make it rather easy for the enemy to target me, but I can also bring my guns to bear. If you have 3 battleships bearing down on you like that, it's actually a little easier for you to not get torpedoed. And maybe for the enemy to miss you, because you're presenting a sleeker target to hit. Now, I think that covers the biggest issues with formations. One critical thing is to, unless you really have to, don't hit this button. Don't give a division control to the AI. Or rather, let me rephrase that. Don't let the AI control your division. Because they're just terrible at it. They just do all sorts of unpredictable stuff. I haven't really seen that they're great at dodging torpedoes. It's just not really something that in the current phase of the game I have a lot of faith in. Because more often than not, they have messed up. They have messed up really bad. So don't give the AI control. Now there is one final command that you can give your fleet. Withdraw. Retreat. It's something that in at least custom battles you don't really need to do. There are some missions, however, where you have to have a particular ship survive. And maybe by the time that the campaign comes out, if a ship gets heavily damaged, you don't want it sunk, you want it retreated, so it might be able to get repaired. I don't know how it's going to work in the campaign, but that's my theory. That's when you hit retreat. Keep in mind, if you do this, you'll retreat the whole division. It's not just one ship, it's the whole div. And that does bring me to the last button to discuss, attach or detach from division. Be very careful what you're doing and how you're clicking this button. It sounds a bit stupid as I say it, but here's what I mean. If I click on the whole formation, and then I click detach, it orders the selected ship, which in this case is all of them, to detach from the formation. So if I click this, I now suddenly have 3 divs of 3 single battleships. So Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Louisiana. Now, maybe I can make this work if I split up my light cruisers as well and tell, for example, Marblehead and Providence to start escorting Louisiana in a screening formation, as we've just discussed. But it does mean that you have to organize your fleet a whole lot different, and that you have to manage more separate divisions. Now again, if you want to resort them, just drag them over each other. Drag these things back together. Just keep in mind how you do it. Because I didn't do it in the right order, and the game now has designated the Pennsylvania as leader for your formation. That's not great, because here's what's going to happen. The Pennsylvania is going to lead the formation. Tennessee is going to do all sorts of weird maneuvers trying to fall in behind Pennsylvania. And Louisiana is going to do all sorts of weird stuff to try and fall in behind Tennessee. So this formation is not great. Detach. This means that only Pennsylvania has been detached. I want Tennessee and Louisiana to follow not Pennsylvania, but I want to have the guys follow the Tennessee. So once again, detach. And I'm going to tell Pennsylvania to join the division of the Tennessee. So that's Division 6. Join Div 6. And now it's immediately going to start following Tennessee again. Louisiana, click, and join the battleships. Here we go. And now I have one formation again. You can, if you want to, add all sorts of different ships to one formation. It's not ideal, however, because if you have battleships in a formation, you'd probably ideally want to keep those at range. If you have destroyers, you might want to get a whole lot closer. And if you have those in the same division, the battleship might thrive at range, but the destroyer doesn't, and vice versa. At close-in distances, your destroyer might feel right at home because it can, at least with my current destroyer build here, it can use those 8.5 kilometer range torpedoes. But the battleships are at far greater risk of running into torpedoes. So ideally, stick with your ships in one formation as they are the same class. So battleships in a div, battle cruisers in a div, but you could, if you want to, mix a division of heavy and light cruisers. Or have, for example, 2 or 3 destroyers plus 1 light cruiser. And that way you can have a killer group that only goes after enemy destroyers. Now there are so many different options about how to use your ships that I'm not going to go into that in this particular video because it's already running quite long and I don't want to bore you for the next 90 minutes. So I'm not going to go into that in this vid, but experiment with it. Try and figure out what formations work best for you. I highly recommend the screening command because it makes life a lot easier. It really means that you don't have to micromanage as much. So use that screening command and tell them to follow a ship of your particular persuasion. Could be a battleship, could be light cruisers following heavy cruisers, whatever you like. Now, I hope that this tutorial was useful. I hope it helped you get a bit of a better understanding about how to use formations, and especially how to start the battle and how to look at how you might want to organize your formation. I'm not saying this is the right way to do it, because every single situation is different and will or might call for a different tactic. If the enemy fleet was consisting of a whole bunch of destroyers, for example, I wouldn't tell my light cruisers to screen. I would tell my light cruisers to get the hell in there and start taking down destroyers. So every situation is different. Anyway, I hope it was helpful to you. If it was, please give the video a like so more people can find it easier and that it can help more people. If you're if you are not subscribed to the channel, then please do, because that really helps me out. And you might like some of my other Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts content as well. Thank you for watching. Good luck with your fleet, and have fun playing Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts.